The good news about working in government right now is that we have a huge number, well, I shouldn't say huge, we have a strong number of tools, resources, best practices that anyone who's starting right now should not be starting from scratch, that there is a field of practice that we need to be sharing and learning from each other. In thinking about the issue of race and racism, it was really not about African American people, but about white people. Because one of the things about race is that we often talk about race from a perspective of it's a system that has caused negative impacts for people of color. But it's really clear to me, too, that this is a damaging system that has caused huge dysfunction amongst white people. And the fact that because racism is a system that's been created around this concept of whiteness, it's really limited white people in the way that we have relationships with our own white people. For me, the theory of implicit bias and the research around it, where it is most useful is actually moving to action. So for us to be able to see what this is and what impact it has, and then to develop strategies to counter implicit bias. And so how do we actually look at the impacts of bias as they're playing out in our communities? And how does that inform what our strategies are? Because ultimately, that's what we want. We want to, when we're talking about race, right now, race can be used to predict how well you're going to do in any indicator for success. And so when we talk about racial equity, that's what we want to address, eliminate those inequities. So I want to share just a little bit about differences between explicit and implicit bias. Explicit bias is that which is expressed directly. It operates at the conscious level. People are much more likely to be aware of the fact that they have bias. Implicit bias is expressed indirectly at the unconscious level. Oftentimes people don't even recognize that they have bias. And so an example here between the two. When I was the director of the Office for Civil Rights in Seattle, we did fair housing testing. And so what fair housing testing is that you send, when we're doing it on race, send a white person and an African American person out to look for housing. They've got the exact same profile, the same income, the same rental history. The only thing that's different is their race. And then compare notes after the fact. Now, Seattle is a place that prides itself, I think, on being a progressive place and there's lots of things that you can point to about Seattle being a progressive place. Seattle will tax itself endlessly. You put something on the ballot, a low-income housing levy, families and education levy, you put it on the ballot, Seattle voters will pass it. We've got more protected classes than just about anywhere in the country. So there's all these things that we can point to that we're good progressive people. And yet, when you look at racial inequity, we've got the same inequities, if not worse, than anywhere else in the country. And so the question is what to do with bias. Studies have actually shown that when people try to say they don't have bias, that it exacerbates bias. And it's a little bit counter to what one would hope. I think that what Inka was saying in the beginning about sort of intent versus impact, when people say things like, I don't have bias or I don't see color, they are actually saying it with good intent, but the reality is that saying that means that you're denying actually neurologists can hook you up to monitors and show that you do see race, that race is actually immediate, like 0.01 second, that people do see race, so it's simply not scientifically possible. But then if you're saying I don't see race or I don't have bias, actually it doesn't give you the opportunity for intervention. And so instead of just saying we don't have bias, it's important for us to recognize that by virtue of being socialized in the United States, we all have bias. My bias will be different than your bias, but there are some collective patterns that emerge, and for us to be able to grapple with those within our institutions and within our organizations. So that is sort of thinking about implicit bias is sort of big picture background, and want to shift to thinking about what creates different outcomes within this context of implicit bias. And I keep referencing the fact that we have both individual and institutional biases, and we've got it happening at the explicit and implicit level. And so we have typically, when we've talked about bias, thought about it from a perspective of individual and explicit. That's the way it gets framed in the media all the time, where someone says or does something, it's a headline, and there's endless conversations about, can you believe so-and-so said that? I think that's racist. That idea that race is all about individuals and that it's explicit in nature. Well, what we know actually is that the way that outcomes are generated is not just by individual acts of bigotry. And that is why we need to focus on implicit at the institutional level as well. So this is an example of breaking those 4 quadrants down into the categories with examples. And this is based on some work with the Seattle Police Department. Police officers themselves gave these examples, and want to share these examples with you and then pause for a second and have you do a little bit of conversation at your tables around where you might have seen implicit and institutional bias playing out. So institutional and explicit bias, an example that they came up with was a police department refusing to hire people of color. That would be institutional, and it would be explicit. If we see that, people should file court cases, should file charges of discrimination. That is illegal, and we should not be seeing it. So the example of institutional and implicit bias that they came up with was a police department focusing on street-level drug arrest, drug dealing. And I loved this as an example because it was really based on their own experience. And the data is interesting. Let me ask you, who uses drugs more, white people or people of color?
White people.
White people. Depends a little bit on the specific drug. There's some variation, but overall numbers, white people use drugs more than people of color do. Who deals drugs more, white people or people of color? The numbers are actually fairly equal around drug dealing. But if you look at the criminal justice system, every single step of the process, from who gets stopped, who gets arrested, who gets charged, who gets prosecuted, who goes to jail, how much time they spend in jail, every single step of the process, there's more and more disproportionality until we get to the end result where we've got mass incarceration, especially for African American men, Latino men as well, but disproportionality in the criminal justice system. So in a conversation with police officers, they talked about rolling back to look at the very first step. If we know that people of color and white people deal drugs at the same level, why is it that we have such disproportionality in who gets stopped? Well, what they said is that people of color and white people deal drugs differently. There's patterns, they're not rules, but general patterns. How do white people more commonly deal drugs? Country clubs and restaurants, bars and parties. Much more likely in social settings, out of college dorms. Sometimes someone will say pharmaceutical companies, that there's much, much less likely to be street-level drug dealing. Street-level drug dealing, much more likely to be African American or Latino. General pattern, not a rule, but that patterns are what we're looking for. And so what police officers said is, if that's the very get-go, the way that we're going after drug dealers, then that's a problem. That's leading into the system of the criminal justice system. And so it's a complicated conversation for them. Much of the research, like looking at teachers, looking at other areas, the reality is that we oftentimes see people of color having implicit bias as well, not to the same degree as white people typically, but you do see implicit bias across races. So it's complicated, street level drug dealing, because the reality is that if drugs are being dealt with in front of your house or your business, there's a strong likelihood that you're going to call 911, right? It's a nuisance. No one likes open air drug markets in front of their residents. And so the fact that police are responding to 911 calls is not the problem. No suggestion that we de-police, but we need to look at it from a more holistic perspective as a part of the criminal justice system if we want to get to different outcomes. Okay, the example around individual and explicit, this would be sort of your stereotypical headline example of a police officer using a racial slur while arresting someone. And sometimes worse than just arresting someone. City of Seattle was under a Department of Justice investigation around bias policing, which this training, this work with the police department was one part of it. But all of the incidents that led up to the investigation were individual and explicit, many of them documented on videos, on phones. Individual and implicit. The example they came up with here is that a police officer more likely to call for backup if the suspect is a person of color. Now, it's fascinating when they put that up on the flip chart as an example. I put it up there. It seemed like it was an okay thing to put there, but it actually triggered something in my mind because I thought I had read some research around this particular topic, and there actually have been studies done that have shown that this isn't just a matter of an individual police officer being more likely to call for backup if the suspect is a person of color. But again, it's a pattern that takes place across police officers in a police department and across police departments across the country. So when something is in the individual and implicit category, always want to encourage people to look at it from a perspective of the institution. Because if it is an institutional pattern, then we need to have an institutional response to it. Make sense? Come up with some examples of implicit institutional bias from your own organization. And I really want to emphasize from your own organization. Part of the power of working in organizations is that that's where you have the ability to drive change. It's easy to point out what the police department is doing wrong, but what we know is that implicit institutional bias plays out in every institution and in every organization. So the more that we can take responsibility for our own organizations, the better. We have not only racism, we've got sexism, heterosexism, all of that is playing out at the same time. And the reality is that implicit bias when it comes to gender, sexual orientation, ability, all of it, you can use the same framework for thinking about whether it's implicit, unconscious, explicit, conscious. Part of my emphasis in focusing on outcome is that we need to have sort of complex enough understanding so that we can say, yeah, it's income and class, or income and race at the same time. The necessity of pulling them apart, we really emphasize centering on race because of the reality that race is so often the elephant in the room. And we have seen too many strategies that are quote unquote about ending class-based differences that actually perpetuate racial inequities. So that's not to say you don't talk about income inequality or gender inequality, but that we just have to have a complex enough understanding of it. Well, when Seattle first started the Race Social Justice Initiative, one of the initial concerns that was expressed by some department directors was a concern that it's going to be divisive, that it's going to cause stress and tension in the workplace. And while, recognition that that could be the case, reality is that race is already causing stress and tension in the workplace. Question is whether we're actually doing anything about it. So had the experience of providing clear training that is not about sort of pointing fingers, but about identifying a racial equity analysis, looking at outcomes and looking at behaviors and actions that can actually drive to change. And we track data over time, looking at the impact in the workplace. The thing that was interesting about sort of the question of whether it was going to be divisive, we did employee surveys every 2 years, specifically around racial equity. And what we found is that the departments that were most aggressive in working on racial equity were the ones that had the healthiest workplaces. that it actually increased the positive morale in workplaces. And what we find is that the reality that we are so uncomfortable to talk about race, that's what's creating tension. And so really just naming it is oftentimes a breath of fresh air. What the research shows, there's sort of fast thinking and slow thinking when it comes to the way that your brain processes. And racial bias resides in the part of your brain that's unconscious and fast thinking. So it's where, sort of the gut reaction kicks in. And so slowing down in making decisions actually allows you to have better ability to counter bias. So yes, definitely. And it's part of like thinking about why we advocate so strongly for putting racial equity into decision-making processes. Want to move on to thinking about how we move on beyond implicit bias. That it's not just enough to say we've got it, but actually what do we do, recognizing that it's perpetuating outcomes. So want to share what we consider national best practice of working to advance racial equity. 3 big buckets of the way that we frame things. Last definitional piece that I want to share is around different types of racism. These are the definitions that the Government Alliance on Race and Equity uses. Oftentimes I'm asked the question, do we have to talk about racism? And I love the title of your series, Putting Racism on the Table, because you all clearly are talking about racism. And it makes a difference. It's really important for people to understand different types of racism. If you're coming into a conversation and people are thinking we're just talking about individual acts of bigotry, and then other people are thinking about institutional and structural racism, if some people are thinking that they're denying that racial inequities exist, you're not going to have a helpful conversation. So having clarity around these definitions is really critical. Institutional racism, policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. Going back to implicit bias, meaning that we don't actually name race, it's just that they work better for white people than for people of color. Structural racism means that we not only have institutionalized racism in a few organizations, but we've got it consistent across all organizations. Plus, we've got this historical legacy of racism, and we've got a culture where racism has been a part of the culture. So for us to get to different outcomes in the community, we have to be able to focus at the structural level, and want to say on top of that, where most of us have the best ability to influence is at the institutional level. So always try to encourage people, yes, work on the institutionalized racism within your own organization. Don't get freaked out about it, just name it as a reality, and then you can pinpoint where there's opportunities for change. And it's collectively that we can then come together to work on structural racism. When we talk about normalizing conversations about race, the things that we think are really critical to name are the history of racial inequities being intentionally created, the difference between implicit and explicit bias, differences between individual, institutional, and structural racism, and the differences between racial equity and racial inequity. 4 simple concepts, and once people have those nailed, you can then have really great conversations around operationalizing and organizing. It means that we start with shared values before we name race, and then when we do name racial inequities, we always draw to institutional solutions, not blaming the victim, not treating symptoms, really looking at institutional responses, and then ending with action. So start with affirmation, then do a counter around communicating about race, and then transformation, taking action. That's really a quick summary around communications. Last thing I'll say is around changing minds. A lot of times people will think, we got to talk one-on-one to change people's hearts, change people's minds. What the research actually shows is that the best way to change attitude is to change behavior. change behavior. When you have an organization that's saying, yes, racial equity is a value, and we have a racial equity plan, and you all are going to use a racial equity tool, first time that people use a racial equity tool, there might be looks of confusion on people's faces. But as we normalize conversations about race and people gain experience, behavior changes and attitude changes. We don't start with attitude, we start with behavior.